Well, hello, Nativity Bible Heads. It is Dr. Wayne, and it is time for Sunday morning Power Bible Study for June 20th. We have a lovely Old Testament Hebrew Bible passage today. It's the classic David and Goliath. I'm going to be using the version of it that we've edited for our worship service, and not the entire chapter of 1 Samuel chapter 17. If you want my teaching on the entire chapter, on the entire episode, which encompasses 16, 17, 18 right in there, all of that is still available. It's posted on the Facebook page and on the YouTube channel that we have. So I'm just going to cover the liturgical section that we have for our worship service. So 1 Samuel 17 is our first verse, our first passage, and we're going to start out with the first half of verse 1, and then go to verses 4 to 11, 19 to 23, and then 32 to 49. The reason why we have to skip around like this is because the stories, as they came to be redacted in our scripture, are kind of like pieced together. And the way our liturgical committee has done this, with the way they've edited our reading for our liturgy, it actually reads much better. It reads much more cohesively. So 1 Samuel 17, verse 1a, and then 4 to 11, and then 19 to 23. The Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. The weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. That's like 125 pounds. He had greaves of bronze on his legs and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "Today I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. So now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the fight of the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with a keeper, took the provisions, and went as Jesse had commanded him. He came to the encampment of the army. He came to the encampment as the army was going forth to the battle line, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage, ran to the ranks, and went and greeted his brothers. As he talked with them, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before, and David heard him. Bum, bum, bum. Okay, so last week in our lesson, David had been anointed to become the next king of Israel. And this is one of those legendary stories about David that starts to gather for him popularity amongst the people. See, even though he'd been anointed to be king, he wasn't going to become king for quite a while. Saul's reign still hadn't played itself out. So this story doesn't really know that David knows that that's what's happened, though. A lot of these stories that we get in Scripture are snippets of legendary tales, and they don't always presume knowledge of what we've read before it, okay? So that's part of the reason why it reads like it does. Because in 1 Samuel, if you were to read 1 Samuel chapter 16, you would see that David was already a part of Saul's army even. So it's kind of a disconnect if you read it contiguously. But in this description of the Philistine, the author, our narrator, the whole point of it is trying to create him as a foreboding presence, something that something was like almost superhuman. By the way, there are, in the Greek version of our Old Testament story, the Greek translation of it, the Greek translation is called the Septuagint. That's what the early church used when they were reading scripture. It has different data with regard to the size of this giant, okay? The thing about him where it being height was 6 cubits in a span, that's like over 9 feet tall. In reality, well, in the Greek translation of it that the early church used, it said it was 4 cubits in a span, which means it's about 6.5 feet tall, which is probably more likely that you would be seen as a giant that tall. They weren't big people back then, okay? They just weren't. So 6, if you are 4 cubits in a span, which is about 6.5 feet, that's pretty tall. That's considered a giant. I'm just saying this to point out the fact that there's different traditions that have come to, that things have gotten settled in on. And in our scriptures, we typically go with the Hebrew version, even if that's different from what our early church went with. So, the thing that this portion is setting up already is that this Philistine, okay, is defying God, okay? And it is setting up David as being the one who was brave enough to battle in the name of God, for God. The idea that, well, who is he to insult my God? I'll take him, that kind of thing. And in these stories about David, they are designed to build him up as this man who, remember, our narrator will later on say, describes him as, a man after God's own heart. Well, this is illustrative of that. Okay. I'm starting now in verse 32. David said to Saul, "Let no one's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." When you're talking to a superior, it's typical for you to refer to yourself to that person as your servant. So that's what he means. "I will go fight with this Philistine." Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are just a boy, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and whenever a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it and struck it down, rescuing the lamb from its mouth. And if it turned against me, I would catch it by the jaw, strike it down, and kill it. Your servant has killed both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, since he has defied the armies of the living God," David said. So David basically gives Saul his resume. Like, I've killed wild animals, I've protected sheep. One of the metaphors for the kings of Israel is that the king is the shepherd, okay? A shepherd of the people. And for David to have been a shepherd boy and to play as a shepherd, I would fight off wild animals to protect my flock. This is all going into him creating credentials, street cred, if you will, for his ability to be king, to be that kind of person that defends people, who defends God, who wants to be the one seen as standing for the living God. Notice he doesn't actually say Yahweh. The Lord, oh, now he does. The Lord, let's see where it says L-O-R-D in all caps. That's actually the covenant name for God. Who saved me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, will save me from the hand of this Philistine. So Saul said to David, so Saul never really catches on to the fact that David isn't conventional. He's not your conventional type of king or conventional type of warrior or anything like that. Look at what he says. Go, and may the Lord be with you. Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a bronze helmet on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. David strapped Saul's sword over the armor, and he tried in vain to walk, for he was not used to them. Then David said to Saul, I cannot walk with these, for I'm not used to them. So David removed them. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the wadi and put them in his shepherd's bag in the pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. So Saul's attempt to get David to wear his armor shows how Saul's vision is short-sighted. Saul doesn't see how the fact that the Lord is the true warrior here. David is the one who is having faith in the Lord, faith in what the Lord has taught him to do, faith in the abilities that the Lord has given him to do. This illustrates the basic differences between Saul and David, in that Saul is caught up in the old way and David is caught up in the new way. And that's one of the lessons that we're supposed to get out of this whole thing is like, how is leadership defined? How is leadership determined? You've heard the word charisma. That's the kind of thing we're talking about. David shows up here as the one with the gift of God, the charisma. That's literally what charisma means, a gift from God, literally. He's not going to rely on the regular warfare things, okay? That menu list of things. Well, if you're going to go to war, you need this, 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 and this. That's where Saul was. Saul was the kind of guy who's saying, oh, you guys are, you and your newfangled ways, and he's stuck in this old way, and the old way of war. David is not. One of the big picture ways that Israel saw God was that God was their warrior. And so David here takes the role of Yahweh in that the means for victory don't look like they're there. No, but victory is going to come anyway, simply because of who you are. The Philistine came on and drew near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. Our narrative really likes David. He likes to talk about his looks. Even though one of the points of the whole thing is that God doesn't rely on that. That's not a determining factor for God. That's a determining factor for us, but not for God. I wanted to say something also about David had the staff in his hand. What's a staff? That's what a shepherd uses, right? So this is a symbolical metaphor because he's going to be king, yes. And notice it says he took 5 smooth stones from the wadi. Wadi, what's a wadi? A wadi was like a dry creek bed. In the rainy season, it would actually be a stream, but most of the season when it was dry, that's what they called a wadi. 5 smooth stones, put them in a shepherd's bag. The sling and all of that was an ancient tool of war. Back in Judges, we're told that there were warriors that were involved that could use a slingshot like this and could like hit somebody, a hair on somebody's head. Okay, so this was not like, oh, where did this come from? Nobody ever fights with, no, this was actually a standard thing of warfare, and it was something to be feared. And if you think about it, when we developed ammunition and guns and those kinds of things, it's basically just a way of speeding up a ball, if you will, going through the air at somebody. Well, this, before ammunition and guns were invented, guess what you did with that thing that you wanted to hit somebody? You had to get it really fast and choo, right? So I just want to point out that this was a standard feature of ancient warfare. All right, the Philistine came near to David. Where I finished was, for he was only a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. So when Goliath sees David, notice he says he disdained him, okay? And again, this is supposed to illustrate a difference by the fact that what David looked like wasn't what he represented. And the Philistine couldn't see what it represented, neither could Saul, for that matter, right? The Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" See, Goliath sees David's shepherd's staff as just a stick, when in reality, it's a sign of authority, if you will. And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the field." This is another way of saying, I'm going to kill you here in the open air. If you kill somebody in the city, you're going to talk about the dogs eating you, because that's where the dogs were. But it's in the open air, it's going to be the wild animals and the birds. Okay? But David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts." He's just, just right on there, right? "The God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." David is just playing the card exactly right. "This very day, the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies of the Philistine army this very day to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the earth, so that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not save by sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." David is taking the attitude here of harem, the idea that this is devoted to destruction. This is a holy war type of a thing, where the Lord will deliver you. This isn't, whatever happens here is happened because God is making it happen. I'm just the guy who's God is using. That's all. Lovely. I love that speech. It's kind of like, this is like, if you're a fan of professional wrestling, I'm not. I used to be when I was a youth. But one of the things that's entertaining about about professional wrestling is it has revived this SmackDown kind of talk, and that's the reason why it has such an appeal to people, is because there's this visceral stuff of this trash talking back and forth, and we see that in this interchange that happened between the Philistine and David. Last paragraph. When the Philistine drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, slung it, and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. Yes. So, it's kind of anticlimactic. We knew how it was going to end. We all know how it's going to end. So the main story is all about the build up to it. The actual happening of it is pretty quick. The idea that there really is no battle. If you read the book of Revelation, where there's this metaphorical gathering for a final battle, even though these warring peoples, and then in the end, there is no battle. There is no battle because it's over like that. This is like that as well, in that it's over like that. It's like one of those boxing matches where somebody gets knocked out in the first round. There is no big war. It's over like that. This is the way it goes when the Lord is on your side. That's the lesson for all of that. Now, I got to move on because I spent 21 minutes on that first one. Psalm 9 to 20 is a congregational response. Once you hear this story, then think of these verses as a response to of Thanksgiving. Listen to this. Psalm 9, verses 9 to 20. The Lord will be a refuge for the oppressed, a refuge in time of trouble. Those who know your name will put their trust in you, for you never forsake those who seek you, O Lord. Sing praise to the Lord who dwells in Zion. Proclaim to the peoples the things he has done. The avenger of blood will remember them. He will not forget the cry of the afflicted. Have pity on me, O Lord. See the misery I suffer from those who hate me. O you who lift me up from the gate of death, so that I may tell of all your praises and rejoice in the salvation in the gates of the city of Zion. The ungodly have fallen into the pit they dug, and in the snare they set is their own foot caught. The Lord is known by his acts of justice. The wicked are trapped in the works of their own hands. The wicked shall be given over to the grave, and also all the peoples that forget God. For the needy shall not always be forgotten, and the hope of the poor shall not perish forever. Rise up, O Lord, let not the ungodly have the upper hand. Let them be judged before you. Put fear upon them, O Lord, let the ungodly know that they are but mortal. Do you see how this fits in as a response, a congregational response to what happens in the David versus the Philistine incident? That we are putting our faith in the Lord, and the emphasis here is how the forces that are really against us, who are of the Lord's community of faith, are the ungodly. There shouldn't be battle between the godly and the godly. It should be the ungodly versus the godly. I'm not going to spend much more time on that. In fact, no more time, because I got to move on. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 1 to 13. We've been in 2 Corinthians for a while. Remember, in this letter to the church in Corinth, Paul is having to defend himself and his ministry a lot. In this passage, we have Paul once again citing his own experiences, his own trauma, his own trouble, and having to point to things in his own life to say, hey, no, I really am an apostle. And so here, listen, verses 1 through 13, 2 Corinthians chapter 6. As we work together with Christ, with him, we urge you also not to accept the grace of God in vain. That's a wonderful little expression right there, right? The idea of accepting the grace of God in vain. You could meditate on that for a while and ask, how have I accepted the grace of God in vain? Do I? Have I? Consider that I have. In what ways? A very good self-looking kind of a question. Okay. For he says, at an acceptable time I have listened to you, and on the day of salvation I have helped you. What Paul is doing here in verse 1 is he is quoting a piece of, it's from Isaiah, and his way of, and in his words, in his viewpoint, Paul's viewpoint, all of the words of the Hebrew Bible come from the mouth of Jesus. So that's the reason why he says, as he says. See, now is the acceptable time. See, now is the day of salvation. So he's quoting that thing and saying, well, what's the acceptable time? Now. Now it is. We are putting no obstacle in anyone's way, so that no fault may be found with our ministry. But as servants of God, we have commended ourselves in every way, through great endurance, in afflictions, hardships, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, riots, labors, sleepless nights, hunger. So that's his litany of things that he has come through, that he has suffered for the sake of the ministry that he's doing. And now he's listing things that they have put out there in response, which isn't tit for tat. It's really, he's giving back something good for something bad. By purity, knowledge, patience, kindness, holiness of spirit, genuine love, truthful speech, and the power of God. So these are the things that he's seeing, that he's put forth. With the weapons of righteousness for the right hand and for the left, in honor and dishonor, in ill repute and good repute. We are treated as impostors, yet are true, as unknown, and yet we are well known, as dying, and see, we are alive, as punished, and yet not killed. It says, like, even though they've given it to us, they haven't gotten us yet. As sorrowful, yet also rejoicing. As poor, yet making many rich. As having nothing, and yet possessing everything. So Paul is just laying it out here. I mean, this is like a mic drop kind of a moment, if you will. Verse 11, we have spoken frankly to you, Corinthians. Our heart is wide open to you. There is no restriction in our affection, but only in yours. And this is just Paul really laying it on, saying, like, you know what? If there's any problem here, it's because you've created it. It's the old, you know, people say, well, it's not you, it's me. Here he's saying, no, it's you. It's not me. I love that. In return, I speak to you as children. Open wide your hearts also. I think this is just awesome. Paul just lays it down and just gives it to him flat out. You know, I'm doing this all for the right reasons, and I'm doing it the way God wants me to. And if you got a problem with that, go to him. The complaint department is over there. Oh, that's wonderful. Okay, 30 minutes in, I got to get to the gospel because this is a good one. We're in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 4. And in Mark's gospel here at the beginning, he's relating things that Jesus does that develops credentials. Again, here is our reading, verses 35 to 41. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." In the Gospel of Mark, there are a lot of crossings. What are they crossing? They're crossing that lake that we call the Sea of Galilee. It's a big lake, but it's not a sea. The sea, the coastal lands, remember, they weren't a seafaring people, the Israelites. They didn't even get to the coast very often because there were bad people on the coast. That's where the Philistines were. So their ability or their abilities in the realm of and their fear of water and wind blowing waves and all of that it was a real fear because it wasn't something that they were used to. Think about our own indigenous peoples in what we call now the United States. There were peoples that lived on the water, and there were peoples who lived in the plains, and then there were peoples who lived in the mountains, and there were peoples who lived in the forests and in the places where there wasn't any trees. So it depends on where you grow up and what you're used to and what you have access to that gives you power over what around your environment. The sea and water wasn't one of them. Remember, the Sea of Galilee was a lake, okay? It wasn't really a sea, but they were still fearful of it as though it were a sea. They didn't have the distinction, the fact that a sea had to be like, couldn't be landlocked. And this is why Galilee is a lake. Let us continue. Verse 36. And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them. They took him with them in the boat, just as he was. So, talking about Jesus. I think it was last week where people were talking about Jesus being crazy. That was his family. But yeah, here he is, had gotten done, and they're saying they just as he was, okay? Like, no time to prepare. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion, and they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" Okay, so the fact that Jesus is asleep at the stern on the cushion doesn't mean that he wasn't concerned. For them, what it means is that he wasn't bothered by the winds and the waves that they talked about. He woke up. Okay, so teacher, do you not care? So they took that as not caring for them. Okay, illustrating where we always make things about us. I think this is a good lesson about, like, consider the degree to which we make things about we make it all about us. We'll hear somebody honk a horn, or we'll see somebody with a mean look on their face toward us, and I don't know. We make things about us that have nothing to do with us. Things are the way they are, and then we see it, and then we somehow think, well, who does he think he is? It's right. This is an example of how we do that, all right? We make it about us, and that's to our folly, because we're not taking into consideration the bigger picture. Well, that's what Jesus is doing. He's the one with the bigger picture. He woke up, verse 39, and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." So this is, if you think about it, this is the resurrection greeting. Peace be with you, right? Peace, be still. Then the wind ceased and there was a dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Why have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" In this rhetorical question, they are actually making an assertion of who he is. We see in this incident a reflection of the time of creation. Remember creation with chaos? And what is it that comes out of, what is it that calms the chaos? What is it that creates out of the chaos? It's the word, the spoken word. And God said, okay? Yeah, so Jesus here is painted in this picture of like, he's acting as God, as the creator God. And this is a very subtle way of Mark putting forth a Christology of Jesus as Son of God. And the fact that the disciples say, well, who then is this? That even the wind and the sea obey him. They're saying exactly who he is, the Son of God, but without actually saying that. Because in Mark's gospel, none of the disciples ever say, wow, this was God's Son. Until who? Yeah, at the cross, the Roman centurion in that movie played by John Wayne. Which movie was that? The Greatest Story Ever Told, I think it might have been that one, where John Wayne plays a centurion who says, truly, this man was the Son of God. It only gets said once, and it's by the centurion. But the fact that the disciples proclaim, who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him, is evidence that the disciples had a clue, and this is why they devoted themselves to him, even though they don't have a good reputation in the Gospel of Mark. They're very much they're a group of people who look a lot like the Keystone Cops several times, but here they are asking a question which goads our mind into active thought about who Jesus is. Mark's Christology is one of the lowest of all the Christologies. John is the highest, Mark is one of the lowest, and in it, in this incident, we get the idea that Mark knows much more about the author, I'm talking the narrator, the overall storyteller of what we call the Gospel of Mark. It's much higher than, he likes to hint at it more than just make direct statements. And that's the reason why it's done like this. Who then is this, that even the sea and the wind obey him, the wind and the sea? So this is our lesson for today as far as the teaching of who Jesus is, and if this is our Lord, okay? Remember, this time of after Pentecost, we're still figuring out what is it like to live life in the Spirit. And I'm supposed to be preaching on this Sunday as well, And I haven't decided yet which of the passages I'm going to choose to preach from. When you see it, I'll be glad to see it too, because I don't know yet at this point. But that's it for today, for June 20th. Until next time, peace.